Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House with the new Swedish poetry with Katarina Frostenson, The Space of Time, and Anna Jäderlund, Lonespeech. Frostensson's translator, Brad Harmon, and Jäderlund's translator, Johannes Göransson, will be joined by moderator, Robin Myers, for readings and discussions. Katarina Frostenson is one of the most notable living Nordic poets, the author of over 20 books. Her work has had major influence on Swedish poetry since the 1980s. She has, in addition to written drama, prose, and operetta librettos, and translated works by Duras, Batilia, Bove, and Michelou. Frostenson has received nearly every literary prize in Sweden and many across Europe. Her writings has been translated over a dozen languages, ranging from French, German, Italian, and Spanish to Belarusian, Croatian, Polish, and Serbian. In 2003, she made a Chevalier for the French Legion of Honor in recognition for her service to literature. And in 2016, she was awarded the Nordic Council Literary Prize, Scandinavia's most prestigious literary honor, for the present collection. She has also been translated into French and Italian, and in 2019 to 21, she released an auto-fictional trilogy, K, F, and A, the first which premiered at a stage play in October 2022 at the Folketeater in Gothenburg. Her latest book, Alma, has appeared in 2023. Anne is a poet as well as a translator and playwright. She is widely acknowledged as one of the leading Swedish poets for the past 40 years. Her second book, which once has been Meadow, set off a fierce debate in Swedish media, which is known as the Ed Jäderlund debates, about the role of mystery, accessibility, and gender in contemporary poetry. She has gone on to write over 11 books of poetry, as well as children's books and plays. For her work, she has also received numerous awards and honors, including the Inari Prize, the Bellman Prize, the Nine Big Prize, and the Eric Lindgren Prize. In 2022, her collection of poems was published by Bonniers. For the translators, Johannes Göransson is the author of 8 books of poetry, including The Summer and the Collaborative with Sarah Tuss Afrik, and The New Quarantine, a translation of Göransson's first book of poetry. He has translated several poets, including Asa Berg, Anna Jäderlund, Helena Boberg, and Eva Kristina Olsson. Göransson was born in Lund, Sweden, but has for many years lived in the US. He is the co-founder of Action Books and teaches at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Bradley Harmon is a writer, translator, and scholar of Nordic and Germanic literature, film, and philosophy, a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. He has been an American Scandinavian Foundation Fellow to Sweden, Fulbright Fellow to Germany, and an emerging translator mentee with the American Literary Translation Association. He is also a co-editor of the volume Rilke and the Horizons of Phenomenology, and a special dossier on translation and literary citizenship in the American Academy. The Space of Time is his first debut book of literary translation. And for the moderator, Robin Myers is a Mexican City-based poet in Spanish to English translator. Recent books linked translations include What Comes Back by Javier Peñalosa, The Brush by Elena Hernandez Ponchon, In Vitro by Isabella Zapata, Baracolice by Andreas Neumann, and a copy by Dolores Dorantes. In 2023, the National Endowment of Arts Translation Fellow, she was longlisted twice for the 2022 National Translation Award in Poetry and among the winners of the 2019 Poems in Translation Contest. As a poet, Robin is the author of the forthcoming Central. So please welcome all the authors and translators.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for your introduction, and thank you to the Scandinavia House for hosting this wonderful event that I am so honored to get to be a part of. We are here today to celebrate 2 books that came out in translation last year. I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge, besides my own personal admiration which borders on reverence for the work of these two extraordinary poets and their equally extraordinary translators, just how difficult it is to have a book in translation published in the English language, specifically in the United States, if poetry in itself continues to occupy an often very small, marginalized role in the vast breadth of books that are published. Poetry in itself is a very small part of it, and translation is a minuscule part of it. So I just want to say also that, express my admiration and my solidarity and my delight that these translators have persisted and have found publishers also who are here also with them today, with us today, championing these important works. I will just say a few very, very brief words about both books, and in doing so, I'm going to be borrowing a bit both from the Scandinavia House description and from the translators' notes themselves, which are two beautiful texts that I encourage everyone in getting to read the books themselves also to delve in to the essays that the translators have written about their work. Beginning with The Space of Time by Katarina Frostenson, translated by Bradley Harmon and published by Threadsuns Press. The Space of Time is an unsentimental and smoldering study of the ecological and utopic function of grief. And in Brad's words, if Frostenson has a philosophy of language, it is one that manifests through an attuned attention to how language and world are enfolded within each other, and thus both exceed themselves, conjuring a yearning for something more primordial. And at its most innovative, Frostenson's poetry resists recourse to conventional ways of understanding, instead invoking a hermeneutics of the body, of association, of sound. And in the case of Lonespeech by Ann Jäderlund, translated by Johannes Göransson and published by Nightboat Books, this is Johannes speaking in his translator's note, actually to be honest, paraphrasing from Johannes's wonderful translator's note. This is a book of stark gestural poems about the trials and failures of communication, drawing on the correspondence between Ingeborg Bachmann and Paul Celan. These poems push back against the simplicity of her language. It's an idea I really love. By twisting syntax and breaks, they catastrophize cliché. They explore layers of supposed untranslatability. They aren't hermetic, but penetrating, poisoning what's around them. So we have a unique opportunity today to get to hear these poems in the voices of both their poets and their translators. And I'd like to first invite Katarina and Brad to read two selections, I believe, from The Space of Time.
Thank you so much. Januari, kom i ditt skavande, lätet av saven skruvar sig sakta och säkert upp genom stammen, det enda trädet på gården. Barkens allmän ord, här var eviga dag, här som i härd, som i härda ett härad. Vaga fågelröster bland kvistar, kvitter som prickar, att höra för första gången på länge, höra en januaridag, gråsparv. Att skingras, vidgas en smula och ljus sila fram genom gliper bland molnen. Du kan se, du kan alltid se ut, vad det än vara månde där ute.
January, come with your scraping sound of sap squirming slowly and safely up through the trunk, the lone tree in the yard. The bark's banal word, here, every single day. Here, as in hearth, as in hear, the harmony. Vague bird voices amongst the branches, chirping in staccato. To hear for the first time in a while, here, a January day, sparrow. To dissipate, gentle dispersion and light sifting out through gaps in the clouds. You can look, you can always look out, whatever may be out there. A herd of black padded jackets before a row of letters carcassed onto newspaper headlines, inching sideways, forming patterns. A lattice of language, A noise cage, narrowing hearths, all of it harried, the unfamiliar world at home. Sealed up, driven away, to retain and resist images of the ruined, to host, not be consumed, not fathom how the world goes on. A father's gravelly breath path, expectoration, belong to leaden days, a distant ejection, the longing unto ash. This month hardens reality. What am I to love here? The question real and unworthy. You groan, mortal. Misery, you think. The despair of despair. Think air instead. As if the simplest thing in the world to say. A single word, durable. Like she who taught me to trudge, tug along, smiling, struggling, in anguish. Turn on a dime. Sweet little girl, everything will be fine. Exists no more. Instead, windy days, a whistling urge to follow the momentum of the moment. And all the while, language moves, whipped by the wind, torn into tissue, hastening in the cardinal directions, one with the migratory birds. Think. To rise up is quite simply to carry on, at stages on life's way that coax you to resound, exquisitely, wordlessly, hopelessly. You will still be called song, you who pull the barge. Be diligent, language, you are on guard. Someone must tighten the sail and embrace. And since I stood by the willow on the hill, looked out over the valley next to the tracks, as the wires above swung and shivered, sang elegantly in the air, that space, infinite, confined by bending cords. A space, yes, that's it, and a capacity. So many words have passed by in persistently erratic streams, and often an impulse to just break away from it all. Let it lift toward the clouds or sink. The whole heap of words may go under. Time will take care of that in the end, surely and sorrowfully. But ever since I stood there by the willow on the hill and looked out over the tracks and sensed a space with your warm, rugged hand upon mine, it was a first feeling of a future emerging from those words that endure and invade understanding, but still resound that 7th of January long forward in time.
Sångens gångar. Sången kommer, inte vandrande. En hjortrörelse i den trånga gången. Bålen kränger. Ett kastregn ut. Att genomströmmas stillastående. Att dra samman åter. Jag är den väg sången tar. Amorf och strängig. Du kan väl ändå komma lång och rund som en gång, den första gång jag såg dig. Sjung för mig, låt det gå runt. Åh, kom och bågna. Arielsång, ding dong, korallkläppen, slå klocka, gå mot grunden, rör på orosknotan. Gengångare, sot och solansikte. Oemotståndliga, kom, dra mig med, lämna mig på vägen.
Song paths. The song arrives, a sure step, the flicker of a fawn on a narrow path, the flare of a fire, a downpour, to be deluged while standing still, to be pulled back together. I am the path the song takes, amorphous and taut. You, song, can still return long and meandering, like that one time, the first time I saw you. Sing for me, let it flow, come and crumple. Ariel's song, ding dong. Choral tongue, the clock must strike, must get to the core, to the bone of disquiet. Revenant, face full of soot and sun, irresistible. Come away with me, leave me on the way.
Thank you so much, Katarina. Thank you, Brad. And now I would love to invite Johannes and Anne to read from their selection.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Rösten bränns. Jag kan se ordet. Det går genom ögat från hörseln. Det är giftigt med klar hastighet. Tala, du.
The voice burns. I can see the word. It goes through the eye from hearing. It is poisonous with clear velocity. Speak you too.
Uppe på berget finns träd och floder. Och bakom berget andra berg. Vad floden vill vet ingen. Den rinner, hiskar.
Up on the mountain, there are trees and rivers, and behind the mountain, other mountains. What the river wants, no one knows. It runs lard.
Solen går i aortan. Ordet för mörker döljer ett mörkt ljus. Vad gäller då?
The sun goes in the aorta. The word for darkness hides a dark sound. Then what's at stake?
Längs floden finns stenar och berg som löper. Vargbönor, lupiner. Varje frö i säcken trängs med de andra. Tickar. Tala, du kunde det.
I totally got lost. We can see det var det.
Ja, i din bok är det en annan sida.
Oh,
Along the river. You skip a page. Along the river. There are stones.
oh yes, okay. Along the river, there are stones and mountains that run. Wolf beans, lupines, every seed in the sack crowded against the others. Tick tock, you were able to do that.
Ställ dig så att vinden blåser på dig från köket. Köket är en kammare som går på huvudet i luften. Du är gjord av luft.
Stand so that the wind blows on you from the kitchen. The kitchen is a chamber that goes on the head in the air. You are made of air.
Mig har man huggit i hjärnan.
I have been stabbed to the brains.
Solen slår ut sitt ljus över fönstret som inte finns. Sitt ljus som inte finns. Det var ett annat ljus. Och nu är det också något annat.
The sun lets its light out over the window, which does not exist. Its light, which does not exist. It was another light, and now it is also something else.
Alla har brist i ögonen, nävar. Förvridna flod, berg. Hemma, i orden hemma.
All have needs in their eyes, fists, contorted river mountain. At home, the words are at home.
Skog, svarta, alla klang. Skog, svarta, för huvud, för klang. Jag vill höra.
Forest clang, forest black, all clang, forest black, forehead, foreclang. I want to hear.
Mångvändbart och förlorat går det igen. Hister, bredvid för sig, för tjejer. Men vad? När arnikan blommar gul blir den gula fläcken synlig, sägs det.
Multi-reversible and lost, it comes back again, lard, alongside, alone, seeps through, but what, when the arnica blooms yellow, the yellow spot becomes visible, it is said.
I don't know if we are reading too long. No.
Great on time.
We have
Okay.
time. Så egendomligt. Allt utan. Nästan alla. Allt. Oskattat. Utan.
How curious, everything without, almost everyone, everything unshafted without.
Vi skopar de ljuden. Skopar och klagar. Det går inte att ta bort med ord. Men det går bort med orden.
We scoop the sounds, scoop and moan. It cannot be taken away with words, but it goes away with the words.
Var är du? Var kommer du vara i sommar? Jag hör händerna, floden.
Jag missade det där. Vilken dikt är det?
För dig är det på sidan 35 kanske.
Okay.
Var är du?
Where, 34, okay. Where are you? Where will you be this summer? I hear the hands, the river.
Okay. Jag går till sidan 38 för dig kanske. I skogen. Okej. Okay.
Yeah.
I skogen gnags luft och stammar på rot mot varandra öde. Allting är slump och öde i livet. Välsigna du och nåd Herre, du för det ögonblick, jord, lycka, brist, ensamhet, luft, glädje.
In the forest, air and rooted tree trunks gnaw against each other. Fate, everything is chance, and fate in life. Blessed are you, and mercy is what you bring. That moment, earth, joy, lack, loneliness, air, joy.
Ingen har namn. Ingen. Alla vet det, men har bara namn. Namnen och namnen. Ingen har namn, men alla vet.
None have names, none, everyone knows it, but here only names, names and names, none have names, but everyone knows.
Det bränns idag, det är viljan. Jag glömmer, jag kan vända på roten, synas, svälja. Den brister, vara glad.
It burns today, it is the will. I forget. You can turn on the root, swallow, be seen. It bursts, be glad.
Kom fågel, kom trast, kom röster i skogen. Kom fågel, fågel.
Come, bird, come thrush, come voices in the woods, come bird, bird.
Är det du, mitt hjärta, som jag inte tror? Jag vill ta bort mina händer.
Is it you, my heart, that I do not believe? I want to take away my hands.
Än en gång gör jag fel. Jag ställer mig på tå. Jag sträcker fram mina händer. Jag blir inte mottaglig.
Once again, I make a mistake. I stand on my toes. I reach out my hands. I am not received.
Men var är det? Det är ljus, fiska, snö, väpnad.
But where is it, the light, lash, snow, awe?
Växla ton, älska, var tyst.
Shift, tone, love, and be silent.
Floden är vild idag. Idag får den tårar. Den är giftig. Alla ljud som träffar. Berget, solen.
The river is wild today. Today it has tears. It is poisonous. All sounds that hit the mountain, the sun.
Försök då att svara mig på riktigt.
Try then to answer me for real.
Men mot dig själv gör du det, människa, som man ur ordet smälter någon annan.
But to yourself you do that, human, as one from the word melts someone else.
Blomman är blomman om det här. Floden är floden.
The flower is the flower about this. The river is the river.
Jag ska lyssna på dig. Men hjälp mig du med genom att lyssna på mig.
I will listen to you, but help me, you too, by listening to me.
Floden går upp. Den lägger sig bara en liten bit. Solen stiger. Jag har ingen att tala med.
The river goes up. It lies down just a little bit. The sun rises. I have no one to talk to.
Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne and Johannes. It's beautiful. And I want to apologize. I misinterpreted a pause in the previous reading set and I overzealously passed us along. So Brad and Katarina are going to read a few more short poems. Once again, I'm very, very sorry for interrupting you.
Röstgräs. Röstgräs. Ordet natten gav reste dig ur sängen. Kanske minnet av en Gullbergrad. För vilsna fötter sjunger gräset. En här där ute, väven av dödas röster, utan ljud som gräsets växt. Jag är din matta var du går.
Voice grass. Voice grass. The word the night bore pulled you out of bed. Perhaps the memory of Gullberg. The grass sings for feet astray, a flock out there, voices of the dead woven without sound like the growth of grass. I am your carpet where you tread.
Ordets formler. Jag samlar rader, jag samlar pinnar, jag samlar blad och ord. Jag skiljer agnar åt och sår. I ordets språk finns sår och påk. Det är kännbart. Erfara vore ordet. Något entonigt och faran. Att härleda. Etymologi är ingen filosofi, men förströr för vida är roligt. Myrors stigar liknar driften. Att skriva är inte att leka, men i närheten. En lekfull tanke, skriften, alltså dans. Att vända på stället, att svänga om, stå på huvudet med pannan mot jorden. Stå i ordboet, vimla på jorden. Gräv med nosen i orden, driv ut viltet i ljuset, dra upp och dia konsonantroten. Dikt, som att ordet är stukat på mitten, brutet i linjen, så ska det inte låta. Bär fram och bär emot det. Linje, längtan att löpa längst med, att bara dras med, motstånd lika så, ledade motspänstiga språk, latin. Och vad jag skulle vilja kunna latin, det mest fysiska av språken, det mest påtagliga, stavar, spakar, urverk, en låda med redskap. Lär mig att använda färre ord. Lär mig att bruka plogen. Lär mig att begagna harven jag talar om. Det är en pinnharv för att vara exakt. Bra, vi tycker om att vara exakta. Ord ur okänd film.
Formulae of the word. I collect lines, I collect sticks, I collect leaves and words. I divide, devote, and despair. In the word language, there is age and gauge. It is palpable. Experience would be the word. Something monotone and observant. To derive. Etymology is no philosophy, but it amuses, leads us on, is fun. The impulse, like the paths of ants. To write is not to play, but not far away. Perhaps a playful thought, writing, that is to say, dance. To turn in place, to turn around, stand on your head, with your brow to the ground. Stand in the word dwelling, abound on earth. Dig around amongst the words, drive the wild into the light, pull up and nurse the consonant root. Dikt, as if the word is sprained midway, broken midline. It shouldn't sound like that. Bring forth and bring along. Linje, longing to leap along with it, to just be drawn along. Resistance to, articulated, tenacious language, Latin. Oh, how I would love to know Latin, the most physical of languages, the most tangible. Staves, levers, clockwork, a box of tools. Teach me to use fewer words. Teach me to use the plow. Teach me to make use of the harrow of which I speak. It is a pin harrow, to be precise. Good. We like to be precise. Words from an unknown film.
Formel. Hör du nu? I ljuden upphör här mitt jag. I ljus spiral. Solen torst. Frosten såll. Ner faller regnet. Upp stiger livsljuset. Levnadsmörkret.
Incantation. Listen up now. In this resonance, myself ceases. In light spirals, Sun thirst, frost sieve, down falls the rain, up stands the light of life, the darkness of living. Tackar.
Tack, tack.
Thank you so much, all of you. It's a real joy to hear all of you read. And now we have a space an opportunity to talk, all four of us, five of us, before we open up questions to the audience. So I hope those of you who are listening in and watching in, you'll start thinking about what you might like to ask. And in the meantime, I have just a very general question for both the poets and the translators today. I think I, like many people, I'm interested certainly in how both poets and translators approach their work, but I find that those sorts of conversations can often become either sort of overly mystical or overly procedural. And so I thought what I'm most interested in hearing about is the relationship between intention and surprise. What is it that you thought you were doing, and what is it that you ended up doing as both poets and translators? And so for the poets, and I'll start with Katarina, I'd like to ask that very thing. What was the book you set out to write, and what surprised you most about the book you ended up writing? And for the poets, I hope you'll feel free either to answer as you wish in English or in Swedish with the help of your translators.
I cannot say that I set up to write a book. Poetry for me is not a project. I have never seen it like that. Poems come from the unexpected and from the temporary and from very small things. And of course, then you start to set things together, it develops. But so I can never say I have a plan. It's not an investigation or something like that. But as for me, I write both very short poems and very, very long poems. So for some of the longer poems, which often has to do with grief and with loss and with time, of course, there is some kind of searching. And when I look at the book now, I reread it after 10 years, I'm not surprised, but I think of one thing, and that is that for me, it's a book of air, if I say so. It's not about earth or fire or water. It's not heavy. For me, it has a lightness, and that's perhaps it strikes me when I read it now, after all this time. Yeah.
I love that, a book of air, and sort of getting, after all these years, a sense of the element that defines what the book came to be. Thank you, Katarina. And for you, Brad, I'm curious, what brought you to Katarina's work? How did you get started? How did you get involved in it and with it? And can you tell us about a moment that surprised you, whether that's about the book itself, or a challenge you encountered, or a decision you made as you translated?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's almost, maybe not to the day, but to the month, 9 years ago that I first discovered this book, similar books, by Katarina. And it was entirely by chance. And I write about this at length in my translator's introduction. That was really a matter of chance. I was an undergraduate, and I was at the library. And all of Katarina's books, they're all, I have them all here too. They're all very, very colorful, and they were all on the top shelf of the library. So they stuck out to me, as I had a habit of going to the library and procrastinating by reading new things rather than doing my homework. And so it was a very much a random January day that I came across these books. And at the time I was studying many different things, but it was kind of an auspicious moment because these are the books that kind of intentionally or not sent me on a different path than the one I thought I had to be on. Which is to say, I started studying Scandinavian literature professionally, which is to say graduate school. I began to read Swedish. I began to read these poems. I began to read these books, and my Swedish was not I don't want to say not very good because that's a false adjective, but it was very new. So it was very new to Swedish when I discovered these poems, and so that's why I say it was 9 years ago. So it's taken a very long time, not only for my Swedish to develop and deepen, but also my familiarity with these poems and with these books as well. And I think it takes time. And so when you say something that surprised me, I mean, there are certainly moments when I finally figure out what's going on, or I finally figure out a phrase or a line that just puts me in a really good mood for the rest of the day. That happens, of course, but I think it's almost less of a surprise and more of a, I guess I'm surprised when I think about it that it's been 9 years and I've stuck with this book for 9 years, so to speak. I didn't start out wanting to translate it. It was about halfway through in 2020 that I decided, okay, let's do this. It was a pandemic project, so to speak. But let's just say that, I'm very surprised by how much patience and resilience I've had with sticking with this book for so long and really taking the time with it and letting it evolve and letting the poems unfold. Mostly it's a surprise for me because I'm by nature rather impatient and a stubborn person. So I don't know. So it's there's something to be said about sticking with a project for a very long time, and I think translators of poetry know that very, very well.
Very unique sense of time, I think. The work of actually sitting with the project and living with it for so long, and then the course that it takes and the time that it takes to find a publisher for it. It is a mysterious process in many ways, but I'm very, very glad that patience kicked in and perseverance kicked in. And this is your first translation, your book-length translation, am I correct? Well, congratulations. That is very, very wonderful for us all. And now I would like to ask basically the same questions of Anne and Johannes. For Anne, what was the book or what were the poems you thought you were writing, and what surprised you about the poems you ended up writing?
Yeah, I always think it's very difficult to talk about what you are doing because I really don't understand. I just wanted to be in a field or atmosphere where I examine what this accord is and not misunderstanding and how it influences humans. So this letters between Celan and Bachmann, and also between Celan and her husband Max Frisch, and there are also other letters between Rilke and Tsvetaeva. I have picked words from. I was interested in this accord. I don't know if it's the right word when you don't agree.
Yeah,
you are enemies, and I think it's a very human thing to have these moments. I have had them, several of them, in my life. So I was interested in perhaps finding a solution, how to solve them, but I never succeed. And I'm always surprised when the book is over and disappointed that I didn't succeed this time either. But then you can try again. I always want more than I can manage to do with my books. But I can nevertheless be rather content, and since the book always comes out as something else than I intended, and that's good, I think. Also, that's about all I can say about it.
Very
So,
wise and eloquent.
to me, the process is very mysterious. I write as Katarina. The poems come from where I don't know. And then I have 100 poems, and then it takes me some years to put the poems in an order that makes the book something else than I thought. I like that, but it's also terrible to sit with poems for several years and try to be fresh with them over and over again. So I'm in that process now, putting end to a new book. So I'm rather tired of it. The book and the poems are new every day, I think. It's never the same poem. And then when the book comes out, it's another book for every reader. For every reader, every day. It's a new book. It's interesting that poems can work like that, function like that, I think.
Yes, the state of always wanting more, and then the state of it always being something else. And thank goodness, it would be so much less rich if we always knew what it was going to be. And for you, Johannes, how did you come to Anne's work, and what has surprised you?
I've read Anne's poems for a long time. I really, in the same spirit of not knowing, I don't know why why this particular book is the one I chose to translate. It's interesting, both Katarina's and Anne's poems describe language as describe like the movement and the force and the almost physicality of language. Like what does language feel like when what does another person's language feel like when it enters into you as a reader, when you take a foreign word into your mouth? And I think as a translator, it's really, people often ask me like, well, what's your method as a translator? And that's a question that never really resonated with me, because I always feel like my only method was to like take the other person's language be a reader and just like listen to how the poem sounds. I feel like when I translate this book, it teaches me a kind of syntax, a kind of gestural syntax. And it's so few words, but so much happens in between the different words. And it teaches me a certain kind of gesture. And I feel like when I've read the poems, those stay with me. But when I translate it, it becomes even more so. So there's like an intense form of reading. And I feel like with this book, when I've translated it, it kind of sticks with me for days. Just strange little phrases. Sometimes with Anne's poetry, just like a little preposition or something, like a weird preposition will create a kind of movement and a kind of impact. So that, I don't know if that surprised me or not, but that is definitely something that the effect of translating it was. The other model of translation that's always trotted out is this idea that how do you find the equivalent of the Swedish in English, which has never made sense to me, because if the way I'm describing it, it's like the words are entered into my brain and rearranging my syntax and my brain patterns, and then I use then that brain pattern makes a poem in English. So it's not as, that's why I began by noting how both poems emphasize a kind of physicality of language, where it's not this abstract correspondences that we often talk about in translation. So yeah, that's what I would say is maybe, I don't know if that's qualifies as a surprise, but just the intensity of it.
The embodiment of it also, as something, it's just this reminder that happens in just such in a concrete, physicalized way in translation, but is true of poetry all the time, that it's not just words saying things, but it's words that are doing things together. And so I love what you say about just why this fixation on equivalency. when, of course, a word is going to move, and it's going to move in your brain and in your body, and it's going to move all the other words around it. And that's what the parts and wholes, as the translator Kate Briggs would say, this really intricate physical relationship between the parts of language and the whole they make together, the body they form. So thank you, all of you, all four of you. And we do excitingly have one audience question already. Thank you so much, Jennifer Spector, for speaking up. And if anybody else in this last phase of the event would like to ask a question, feel free to comment in the chat, and I'd be happy to read it and field it to our participants. So here's a question specifically for Katarina, a twofold question. The question is, there is such a deeply felt attunement to sound in the poems read today from the space of time. The way it arrives, lays a path, or in instances is absent. In word dwelling, you write, how does sounding, in the word dwelling you write of, how does sounding in silence energize your poetics? I think of voice grass and bone of disquiet, a corporal inhabitation or agitation as it moves through your landscaper body. Could it be there is a relation there, land/body and silence, the relationship between, as I understand it, land and body and silence? And the question also adds is if Brad has any other thoughts along these lines, those are welcome also.
I'm not sure that can you translate for me, Bradley, the question more? It's about the silence and the sounding. Yeah. Well,
Maybe I can start and go from there. So yeah, I mean the relationship between the language and the body is very similar to what Johannes and Ann were talking about before, which is to say, between the language and the body surroundings, which if I put on my scholar hat is actually a big topic of my PhD dissertation, but I will leave that hat off. What I would say, and Katarina, I'm actually very curious about your thoughts on this, is that throughout your career, for the last 40 years or so, some critics will say that your poetry was earlier very, very closed, and now is very much very open. And I think that's an interesting line trajectory, and I think that's true. But I think what is interesting that throughout the entire all of your work is this focus on the body, and not just the recognition that language is corporeal, but really focusing in and trying to get down into the small parts of language. And so there's another poem in the space of time, which is called Tomorrows in English, where at the very, very end, you have a one word, imoron, or tomorrow, and it just begins to break down into its symbols. And so there's a very much an attention to not just language as something that is material and that the body creates words, even if we're thinking about it on the page in whichever way, but really getting into the small cracks.
Yeah, the syllables. I mean, every little part of language is that's important to me too, and the listening to each sound of the words, and I think that very much of my inspiration comes from song. If I say songs, I mean medieval ballads, and from folk songs, nursery rhymes. That has been so important for me through all my life, and that's an explanation to why I try to sing when I write in one way. But there is another movement too, that I want to stop that singing movement. I want to sometimes to kill it, and I want to break it down, and I want to, perhaps that's where silence comes in, when I want to, because it can be so emphatic. Säger man emfas? Vad säger man på engelska? Emfas. It can be so violent and so dominating this this musical element in poetry. So I often try to work against it. There is some like two different wills in me when I write, and to be very, as in the poems we read about the pin harv, to be very exact and to find, you know, to be concrete, and that's why I write prose as well, and I have to go to leave poetry sometimes because but I always go back to poetry because it's so profoundly rooted in me, and I think it has to do with music. It has to do with, of course, the willing to sing in make the language sing. But silence, of course, is an important element in poems. So, but I don't know. I've often heard that what you said, that my poems were so abstract in the beginning. I don't know really. I think that's this abstract element is always there in some way, and I'm very ambivalent. But I think perhaps with time, and especially when you are in confrontation with the very extreme situations in your life, you must be search some kind of clearness. So perhaps that's something that comes with time and with age, willing to be more concrete and clear. I don't know if it was an answer, but I tried. I agree with Dan. It's terribly difficult to speak about what you are writing, but sometimes it's easier to write, and I've written quite a lot about writing. It interests me to write about writing, my writing and other writers' writing, but it's quite difficult to speak about it. It's like you are betraying yourself, but you must try. It's also a sort of translation. You translate your thoughts, but when you are writing, you are so in the movement of language. You are so much in language. It has so much to do with your intuition and with your sort of desire. So it's very difficult to describe, but it's not impossible, of course. But in English, it's difficult. It could be easier in Swedish.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer, for your question.
Yes, thank you for your question. Yeah.
We have two more questions that have come in. I know we're coming up against the hour, and so of course we understand if there are listeners who need to go, but love to take these questions as much as the poets and translators have time for. Here's one for everyone, and maybe we can start with Johannes and Anne, which is, how collaborative was the translation process between writer and translator? This is a question from Joshua Garcia.
I think the translation process is always collaborative. As far as our process goes, I translated the poems. We met and we talked about it at the what is that museum cafe in Stockholm? It's a Mediterranean museum. And we kind of did the same process when we did the other book we did, which once was Meadow on second book. And in both cases, our discussions were pretty long and intense and very focused on minute word choices. For example, the first poem, the sun dies, open the window and do fly if you want to fly. I did not want to have the do in there, so we had a long discussion about whether do should be in there or not. Or the word ister, which is like what goes into sausages, and which has that word is in Heidegger's discussion of Hölderlin, and we ended up translating that as lards. But yeah, so intense discussions about minutia of word order, individual words, which might sound really dry, but which I find really fascinating. And like I said, Ann's kind of syntactic gestures are really strong and affecting and surprising. So I love to get in there and like think with her about things like word order and word choices, and if a preposition goes here or there, or if the line breaks or something like that. So yeah, I don't know, Anne, if you wanted to add anything.
To me, it was very interesting too, because I have also been translating from English. So I take an interest in how you solve the problem, and sometimes we could discuss what to do with different small problems. This word Ister, for instance, that is the name of Donau in Roman also. So lard is not the only word for the word Ister. But that's the problem.
Anna's translated Emily Dickinson, so has dealt with plenty of issues of word order and
May Bersenbrücke also.
Katarina and Brad, is there anything you'd like to say about your own process working together?
I can say, I mean, as I mentioned before, I mean, it's been a very long time I've spent with this book. I mean, I had to get another copy because this one's falling apart. I don't remember, I can't really say. I could go back and look at emails. I don't know when it was exactly that we first started corresponding and discussing the poems. But I think I can say that when all is said and done, I think maybe I had some 12, I have 12 versions at least of the full manuscript. So that's a lot. And Katarina, I believe you read three maybe versions of it. We also met a couple, at least once in person, and then we discussed a lot over email. I think for me,
we didn't meet so many times. We didn't meet so often because we lived in different parts of the world. But I think you had very good questions, and I often said to you, you must reduce, you must förtäta. And for me, it's extremely important with the rhythm, if it, and the sounding, of course. And it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. That's good.
yes,
thing to remember.
I think one thing too that really was this apropos talking about coming into Swedish, coming into my own sense of the poems, is that I think it took me a very long time to really know what the poems would be or how they should be in English, and that took a very, very long time. And it also meant for me coming to terms, like I think we, Johannes and Robin, everybody, all of us here know that like there's a certain attachment to the source text that I think depending on what it is or depending on whatever, it can be hard to break away from. So it took me a very long time to like let myself figure out how the poems will be in English, because they're different poems. There are very few people that will be able to sit side by side and compare which one's which. And so, but once I finally got that, that's when I really felt like the poems really blossomed. I don't know what Katarina thinks, but she says she liked the final version, so that's good.
Yeah. I mean, the poems are so different. There are these long poems and the short ones. So you have to change mood very often. When you translate, I can imagine, and to catch the very special, every poem is like its own body, you reuse the word body, its own sculpture. And to find that, it's I can imagine how difficult. I have been translating too. Michaud, for example, Henri Michaud, but not so much poetry. I think it's very tempting, but extremely frightening to translate poetry. You have such a responsibility, but you must try to be both like and not the same and not the same. I don't know how to talk. Resemblances and differences. I can imagine. But
a really useful connection to our last question, which is from Nate Kennedy, and so we can all take a moment for this question before saying our goodbyes. Nate asks, continuing with the sounds of the words, how do you maintain rhythm of the words and inflection while translating? I interpret from Spanish to English conversationally, but as a writer, the structure is important to me. How do you address that?
So, is a question to me? No.
For all of you. So any of you who would like to jump in.
I can say when translating, you know, that's the $1 million question for translating poetry, is how do you work with the sound and inflection? Luckily, I should say, I think even though the logic of a lot of Katarina's poems is very sonic, and I think there are many moments when I can do that in different ways. So you have to, I mean, I say that, you know, whenever I can, I try to play with whatever sounds I can in English, but they have to be in English because the sounds are just different in English. Nonetheless, there are still some moments that I really, really, really am proud of that I managed to make it work. Like in the first poem, Januaria, I think it's så elände, I think it was elände tänker du, eländes elände, tänk eld istället. So it's like fire, or suffering, misery, think fire instead. And so it's playing with the constituent parts of the words and how they relate to each other. Whereas I meant, luckily, this is by virtue of English, despair and air fit together. And so sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you can find other ways that don't necessarily map on in the exact same spot in a given poem or collection, where you can, again, it sounds very mystical, which I know we're supposed to avoid, but you know, you can match the spirit of this certain wordplay here or there or somewhere else. So it's just, I don't want to say it's a matter of luck, but it's a matter of really focusing, paying attention to where there are other possibilities that you wouldn't necessarily think of already. And that's a difference between the words and the sounds, which often overlap, but not always.
I love this question, and I think sound has it's an incredibly anarchic force when it comes to discussions of translations. A lot of people are, think about how poem will never sound exactly the same because it's a different language. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what translation is, because translations will always be change in a translation. But also but the sound, what's so powerful about sound in translation is that it will remake, because it cannot be translated, it will exert a force on the translation, on the foreign language. So I feel like sometimes, I think especially when I'm translating Ann's poems, I feel like I get confused am I writing or in English or in Swedish? Which one am I doing now? Because the sound has infected my thinking. So yeah, to me, it's not so much a matter of recreating the sound as allowing the sound to just mess with my brain. And maybe in this case, being somebody who didn't learn Swedish is a disadvantage, because I actually, I sometimes get confused, like what language am I in? Because I don't have that distance of the distance created by like formal education. But yeah, to me, sound is so interesting. Sometimes when I translate, I just leave things in the original because the sound is as important as any kind of signification. It's fascinating also to read how often sound is blamed for translations being ruined. I just read an review of Merwin's translations where this guy accused Merwin of having been seduced by foreign sounds, and as a result his translations were terrible. But I think that's why probably why a lot of people love his translations. So sound, this could be a whole topic for an entire hour, but it's super interesting to me, and I think a lot about it.
So glad we've gotten in this conversation to the topic of sound, and hopefully there will be another time where we can talk for hours about it. But I love that idea of sound as both as an anarchic force, and is often the first thing to provoke anxiety in readers, and just this, and I think it's in the realm of sound, Johannes. It reminds me of what you said about the idea of equivalencies. Is like, you know, how can we find these equivalent sounds? And the idea is specifically we cannot, and that is part of what is so extraordinary that can happen in translations, and something that made me marvel over and over again at both of your translations, Johannes and Brad, is the sort of the force, the life force of the sound that you found and created and continued to nourish and torque and change, which is the sign of a living thing, of a living translation. So thank you, Nate, for this question. Thank you, Brad and Johannes, for your thoughts. And I think we've come to the end, and I just want to just once again congratulate all of you for these incredible books, to your publishers as well, and to the Scandinavia House for hosting us all. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who has joined us to listen.